Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to, I guess, one of the final Nautic lectures. My name is Meg. I'm one of the chief adjudicators. With me is
Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm one of the deputy chief adjudicators.
wonderful. Today we'll be going over strategy, what to do and what not to do. This will be more focused on answering questions and kind of providing advice on how to approach three scenarios. The first scenario being what to do during prep time. And so focused on how do you look at a motion strategically, where are the clashes, and how do we assess that? The second will be focused on extension, but it will not be focused mostly on what extension to run. Instead, it's going to be focused on what to do during the debate. How will we approach these extensions? What is the strategy that we want to convey? And the third section will be focused on what to do before your speech, mostly kind of DPMs and DLOs, focused on how do you respond to a prior speech, but more importantly, what do you know what to respond to? By the end of this lecture, you should be walking away with, I would argue, three kind of main takeaways. Number one, whatever strategy you run needs to be simple and easy to explain. That is, if you can't say it in one sentence as cleanly as possible, it is not strategic or the most strategic thing to do. Number two, that whatever strategy you run is deliberate. That is, that you aren't falling at the end of your speech and collapsing on something by happenstance, but instead constructing that between you and your partners such that 14 minutes of material seems to be cohesive and also well thought out. The final thing is that you are charitable. And I think that this is where a lot of teams struggle in knowing the difference between charitability and then just debating the other side. And the argument here is going to be at what point is proper comparative, even if weighing, actually happening? That is, are you taking out their best and what will the debate look like after that? Pranav and I are going to be trading off on this, and it's kind of going to be informal, as you can tell. We're just kind of going to riff through what we've seen problems to be and really walk through a lot of examples. Feel free to stop and interrupt if you have any questions. And if not, we'll kind of start off from the top. So, what to do during prep time? I'll let Pranav start off first.
Hello. Okay. What I'm not going to cover is like what to do during the entire 15 minutes of prep time. At some point in time, presumably you need to make an argument. You need to say good or nice words. You need to prep that sort of stuff. What I want to do mainly is I think how you start your prep time, perhaps. And the main thing to do is that debate is inherently an activity that's not about like one team just making their case and then just like waiting to see what happens. You can do that, but you may or may not win. The better thing to do is to recognize that debate is an activity of interaction. And that means you must necessarily have or predict where you expect that debate to go. So the main thing you always ought to start with is what often are the clashes in the debate, right? And that means that when you see a motion, you recognize obviously that there are usually things like trade-offs. Hopefully, the reason that's the case is because the CAs are reasonably good, like hopefully we are, and are setting you a motion that's somewhat balanced, which means there must be a trade-off in some ways. You can't have it all. So given this, then you have to ask, and ideally ask in specificity, what exactly you think Gov and Op are going to argue, right? The mistake you often see is people may often argue in generality. I think there'll be a clash on how this actor may act is not the same thing as Gov will argue that they act in this way, and Op instead would argue they act in that way. Specificity is pretty key when you start off with a specific clash. Another useful thing is to figure out what kind of clash you're talking about. So, for example, some clashes are characterization clashes. So, you can imagine in, say, a lot of narrative debates or in some debates about, say, like, is a government or a company going to be more short term than each other? That is obviously something that's more a characterization clash. What is the likely characterization? But there are also just some that are just pure impact clashes, right? Inequality versus growth, a pretty classic sort of both are going for different impacts. What impact do you weigh over and why? So that's pretty helpful in starting to understand what you ought to do to try and win that clash, because sometimes they can be a bit different. The main point of this, though, is to answer the question, what are deadlock breakers? So the mistake teams make is they will recognize the argument they need to make that's intuitive, and they will then spend all of prep time just making or writing their own argument and explaining why that is a generally good or important thing to have. This is really step one of the debate. Because if this is all you had to do, the debate would just end after LO, right? Like the judge would just make a decision on which team made the better argument. No, What really the debate is what comes after that. So what it means is that opening government says one thing, opening opposition says one thing. How do you adjudicate which thing you buy more? Which thing is more important? Which thing is more true? And that's really what you need to be asking yourself, ideally in prep time, right? Why is your side more true or more important than all? Incidentally, the reason you ought not wait to do this right after the round, although obviously you also will have to do this during the round, the reason it's helpful to do this before is one, a lot of the times the best kind of weighing is not just stock ways of weighing. So it's very easy for a team to say, guys, this impact is big, this impact is intense in a vacuum. But that's not important. What's really more important is not in saying, I matter. It's really in saying, I matter more than the others. You ought give me the win more than the others. Implication, you need to try and find different ways of weighing over the other team itself. Now, obviously, you cannot like always perfectly predict their case, and I'm not asking you to do so. But I'm saying starting the step towards doing that is very often very, very helpful in just doing things like writing or having some pre-written weighing. I think it's especially useful in like a lot of like soft or narrative motions, where I think more often than not, since it's usually in some ways about your real life, or maybe not, but at least about like your some friend or family's real life, you have some intuitive notion of what gov and op might look like. And in those instances, you can attempt to immediately charitably weigh. Secondly, related to this then, right, when you're figuring out deadlock breakers, is signpost your metrics of weighing. So the mistake I
Just
think,
before you get there, Pranav,
yes,
one thing to add. Sorry, this is I said riffing off. Pranav emphasizes something that I think is quite important that teams forget, which is if you were to look at an XY plane, because I used to want to be a maths major, assume that the x-axis is how true an argument is. That is, like arguments can be, you can argue, I don't know, for example, the US is a democracy. To what extent you find that to be true is up to you. But probably arguments like, I don't know, creating this policy leading to nuclear war may not be true, or might be. That's one plane. The other plane is how important an argument is. That is, why is this the most important thing? Debaters end up arguing on the axes, but that's not where the debate lays. The debate lays at an intersection. That is, an argument will be somewhat true, but also maybe not the most important. So when you go back and forth on asserting that your side is true and their side is not, it ends up leading to parallel debates. That's when, for example, at the end of a top half, one team argues that accountability will increase, the other team argues that accountability will increase, and the other side's response to each other is they are incorrect. And that's really, really messy. Or going the other way, we save the most amount of lives, that's the most important thing. We save the most amount of money, that's the most important thing. They are incorrect because they're not saving lives, they're incorrect because they're not saving money. Again, the debate becomes planar. When you're able to exercise both, by either mitigation or other forms to why an argument may not be true, and by weighing to explain why an argument may or may not be important, you're actively comparing yourself to your teams and protecting yourself from being boxed out. That I think is the big reason why you want to be thinking comparatively from the get-go, so you don't feel at the last 5 seconds racing to find a way to respond to the arguments when you're already taking arguments at a quote unquote more charitable standard. That's just a small introduction before you continue into the deadlock breakers.
yeah, I agree. That's very valid. And also, I think maybe since both of us also judge a fair bit, I think we can tell you a lot of debates often become messy because teams go through the technical explanation of here are our reasons, let me respond to their reasons and that sort of stuff, right? When sometimes you need to accept that both happen some of the time. Hopefully, you and your opponents are reasonable and smart people, and the motion is often designed to be that way. Which I think leads me on to the next thing, which is on signposting your metrics of weighing. Now, I'll quickly talk through what I think is different. So, like, I think everybody knows the very classic things about weighing. So, like, you weigh on scope or scale or intensity. But there are a couple of things to note about things that could be interesting. So, one, for example, exclusivity is a pretty classic one. So, you may often notice in a lot of debates, you will often see teams like push each other on either side, saying, like, this is symmetric, or this would anyways happen for three random reasons. And opposition, they actually gov is also symmetric for these three other reasons. So sometimes a comparative reason is explaining who is more exclusive and why, or on what metric is a team specifically more exclusive, right? Same thing on like reversibility. Their specific thing is a bit more reversible than ours. So this is sort of thing, this is, I think, an example of it. Another thing is, so scope versus intensity of impact. So you may notice like, so many debates boil down to scope versus intensity. The real thing, I think, is what is the scope of scope? And I should really say, what's the scope of scale versus what is the scope of intensity? And sometimes just making a note of that explicitly in your debate speech, saying like, we're going to explain why the margin of intensity is far smaller than the margin on scale is often really helpful. Like sometimes literally saying it like goes so far with the judges, even if the mech itself is not like airtight. Just because you seem to almost be like accepting or acceding to the judge that is a messy debate, and you will charitably explain how you're winning. The other classic thing is like, which is likely to be true in the majority of instances and why, or why in the instance where X scenario is true, it is the most important instance. So all of these are hopefully like somewhat more charitable things. And the crucial thing is if you signpost it, i.e., if you have like a pithy short title on what that metric ought be, it's very memorable to a judge. So everyone obviously like probably has some complaint over a judge who makes a bad call, and obviously that's fair. But notice that debate is a two-way game, right? It's not just about judges being the best they can be. It's about speakers being the most understandable they can be, the most memorable they can be. You want to make the judge's job a little easy. So these sorts of things like signposting a pithy title can be very memorable to a specific judge.
And that's
Okay.
also how you can be, before you continue, that's also how you can win clarity if you're able to consist this from the top of your speech. That is, take a motion. I don't know. This house, uh, this house regrets the narrative that forgiveness is a virtue. I don't know. I always use that, but imagine that if the strategy you have on opening opposition is to or on opening government is to highlight that certain minority groups, for example, women, were required to forgive more and attributed negative attributes when I didn't forgive, i.e., being bitchy, i.e., being like a jerk or whatever, that was disproportionately put upon women. It is not really helpful if you're going to, in the deputy prime minister at the fifth minute, try to speed run me weighing on like I don't know, an exclusive minority, and like in the fifth minute trying to both respond to opening opposition and be like, we win because here's this minority analysis that I'm going to try to explain and rebut. You lose clarity, but also when you're trying to provide a new weighing metric in the last minute, I don't know what to do with all the other content you just given me. If you're only going to weigh one argument and you're going to tell me this is this one tiny mechanism comparative to that one, I don't know what to do with the other two arguments you've given beforehand, unless you've done that for every single one of them. Most teams don't. Instead, when you're able to approach this debate from the start, so by saying, okay, the area of change is going to be maybe not like the end of the world. I don't think this means like equivalent female liberation just because, but it means that in these areas, on a one-to-one basis, you feel a little bit better. And we don't think it's going to be that large, but it is going to be minimal but consistent. And you begin that both by mechanizing that in the LO, both the comparisons in the DPM are actually clearer because the mechanisms already exist. But B, the strategy is consistent the entire way through, which is also helpful in team cohesion and making the argument stronger. But the most important thing is it's flagged from the judge top down. And when you tell the judge why you were telling them stuff and then proceed to tell them things, I know why I'm writing your content down. Versus writing down mechanisms, having little to no understanding as to why you're doing it, not processing it in my brain as you are speaking, and then waiting until the DPM to then understand this content. Because that means, for example, if you were the prime minister presenting this content and I'm unclear on your strategy, as the LO is speaking and probably rebutting you, I am deprioritizing your case because I don't know why I care. And it takes the DPM to then reassert your case, which means you are starting below par and must be accelerate above par. Versus establishing why I should care in the first place exclusively and being charitable to yourself, not waiting for opening opposition to be like, we don't know why this matters, but accepting that yourself from the beginning and then carrying it to stops OO or any other team from giving frivolous responses, but also protects your case such that I'm consistently like you are not below par at that point. OOs do a lot more work to do it, and most times LOs cannot take out an entire PM speech. That's also why this matters to start off with and continue through the rest of your case.
Yeah, I agree. Like, I think we've spoken about this, but like sometimes there are literally moments when you're tracking a speech very passively because a whole section of the speech is just like, I don't understand why this is important, or there's a very clear burden missing, so I don't care about this. That's almost always why things like signposting or like making very clear why you're saying what you're saying. Like part of the debate is just like you arguing that what you're choosing to spend time on is worth arguing for. That's, I think, a big part of debate as well. The other, like, I think a helpful heuristic that I often remember is like weighing is in some ways a form of argument as well. And if you think about it a bit like an argument, you will appropriately give it the respect it deserves in your speech. Like more often than not, the amount of time you spend on something in your speech is quite directly correlated with at least how much the judge tries to listen to you from the get-go, which means if you just speed through like 3 ways of weighing very quickly, the judge, at least most decent judge, will be like, what? Like, this is not fully tracked. I will not credit this. So, but if you spend like, a little bit of depth and time saying like, this is the way I want to weigh, that's really important. So that's why I feel like picking and choosing your weighing is important. You don't necessarily need more than 1 or 2 metrics of weighing. But what's more important is the care you take in explaining that metric in like a, like a nuanced way. Okay, a couple of just helpful heuristics to ask yourself. They don't apply in every debate, and you need to know when they apply. My general way of figuring out when they apply is like I would just have like a post-it note with each one written down, and then like it would be like a checklist, and that can sometimes help. So one, what is the most plausible change to argue for, right? Some of it is intuition, like what seems like something that most op teams would either find it implausible or unstrategic to disagree, or if they really want to disagree, they'd have to do a lot of legwork to do. So some examples that I try and think about is sort of like what changes and what stays the same. And you try and think about like what is in some ways the most plausible small level change you can go for. Now, to be clear, you don't have to end the case there, but I would always recommend starting the case there. So you need to have something that's plausible. Most judges in BP will hopefully not just credit any large impact that's not fully plausibly linked. You can give a large impact also to avoid some like scale weighing, but obviously start with small ones. An example I often use in a lot of narrative debates in opposition is something like oppression is symmetric, but the way you justify it to yourself is different. That is an example of sort of like this is what is staying the same, but this instead is what is changing. So that I think is a helpful heuristic to ask yourself. It's as also as Meg mentioned, it's a good pithy way of understanding strategy, right? That is to say, your strategy is explainable in a single line. I've started a speech literally with this line, and I think like, and I pretty much won the debate right out of the LO just because of it. So that's the first thing. Secondly, this is like a good question to generally know, which is like, what is the most you can concede of the other side and still win? This is really helpful in certain types of speeches where you hit across. You hit, say, a very matter-dumpy speech, but you recognize one thing that you can do. You come across a speech that's trying to win on several clashes, and you may just choose to like concede a lot of their side and win. I sometimes think like the way I sometimes think is like you want to be slightly strategically lazy, but mechanistically rigorous, by which I mean that you don't like, there are many ways one could win, but don't take the hardest way to win. You want to find what is technically the easiest way to win. You want to find, instead of refuting everything that's coming out of your way, instead of just going down the flow, you want to be like, this is a path to victory. And the path to victory is contingent on how much I'm willing to give up of their case and still find a way to win anyways. This is obviously like really like a very clean way of winning, right? Like to be very clear, especially in BP, BP is a game of time allocation. Well, all formats are a time allocation, but BP is especially valuable. You should not waste your time responding to everything. And what's most important is picking what you're choosing to respond to. And part of how you determine a path to victory is choosing how little you need to respond to and still finding a way to win. A clean way of doing it, for example, is like an impact flip. So you could do something like, they may argue for this specific impact and X impact. Can we explain why their impact is actually a bad thing? This is just an example. It may not apply in many scenarios, but the point of it is to say, like, you see how this can be like very like easy to do in a way. That is to say, like, you don't need to respond to the plausibility of the case. You don't need to respond in some instance to how often the impact happens. You're just flipping whether that's a good or a bad thing. So that's an example of where you are conceding a lot of their case and still finding a way to win. Yeah.
Mind you, the way that you think of this, by the way, in prep time, and I suggest that second speakers really think about this, because I think this is like, as a second speaker, what I think I added to my partnership. During your first 2 minutes of silent prep, the question that should run through your mind should be two things. One, what is opposition's best benefit? And either A, can I access that on my side of the house? B, is that outside of the debate? Therefore, can it be accessed by other narratives? And C, is this actually a good thing? An example, I can't think of any motions that are not we're setting for NAUDC, but like this house believes that the environmental movement should advocate for corporate change, like forcing corporations to shift their behavior versus like individuals. Let that be the case. If opening, and I think we're going to use this later, so unfortunately I'm just going to bring it up right now. But if opening government is going to lament about why corporations are bad. I think we have it written somewhere. If opening government is going to lament about corporations being bad and like how it's really crappy that they don't care about people and woe is us, people aren't going to shift their behavior and that really sucks. If you're looking at this opening opposition and going, okay, corporations are bad, instead of just trying to run into trying to prove that corporations are good, which I think is really hard to do, ask yourself, are there other reasons why people would want, like why corporations would act in a good way that are outside of this debate? Example, it's a really good marketing strategy. Like Dawn putting out an ad that's like, we saved all these little birds that we kind of hurt ourselves with like oil spills. So buy Dawn products means that there's other incentives for this to exist. But bigger than that, I don't know why that's the most important thing to the environmental movement. Like, yes, corporations are bad, but why is this impact valuable? Or why should you care? Sometimes acknowledging that these are likely the best cases of opposition, having this pre-prepared, saves you breath and time, such that when you're giving your DPM, you have this content. So this is how you would acknowledge everything that Pranav is saying. And these are the questions that can flow through your mind. And as you continue to build on these, you can also try to flip their case. So if you know, for example, that they want corporate behavior, a good way to flip their case is saying, here's why you can still get corporate behavior on other sides, and therefore, see prior, this is why personal behavior is exclusive only with this narrative. And therefore, you're proving what Pranav said beforehand, exclusivity, as well as previous changes. Or if you just want to flip the benefit in totality, maybe you say that corporate behavior only happens when personal individuals care enough about this. So if individuals feel like their duty is towards the government or towards the environment, then they will drive corporate behavior by picking and choosing how they spend their dollars. And therefore, we are prerequisite. Only when we get our motion do you get theirs. This is comparative. And if you think about this from the start of your speech, you've damaged the entirety of the prime minister. So now DPM is stuck, either having to prove that they aren't linked, that's really tenuous to explain, or that this is exclusive to their narrative, which even if they do, that means they didn't have time to respond to your case. Your DLO has a perfect chance to go through. That's where this matters, for example.
Yeah, that's very true. Okay. Last thing is, when does this happen and when doesn't it happen? This works in so many kinds of motions. We'll go through an explicit example later as to when this doesn't happen. But the general note to make is like uh there's the presumption, I think, in debate and a lot of arguments you see, which are very general, sort of like a little bit like sense like slightly vague mechanisms to encompass a wide variety of scenarios, a wide variety of contexts or like countries and that sort of stuff. In some instances, obviously that's useful, but in a lot of times it isn't. Sometimes trying to like scope out the debate, saying in this type of nation or in this type of household or with these types of individuals' behavior, this is when this debate happens. You can do what we would really call like like strategic framing. Framing where this debate does and doesn't happen is really helpful. Because obviously, instead of needing to refute every other kind of argument, or instead of refuting every context, you pick the context you want to win and explain why that context is pretty essential. Okay, let's
And
just
before
talk.
you jump into that, just before you jump into that, that's how you sidestep what I just brought up before. If you can pick the context where this is exclusive, you sidestep all the discussion about why other narratives are going to answer this. Because you have to, by nature, expect like setting a context or then explaining why it's exclusive towards this narrative, and therefore cannot be boxed out with here are other solutions to fix that. But yeah, I'm assuming this means we're going to move into the motion prep, or at least one or two of these, and talking through how we'd approach it strategically. Right?
Yep.
Cool. Want to do the first one?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to look at this as if we were opening government or opening opposition or pick your poison?
Yeah. We can do OG.
Sounds goody. So the motion is this House prefers a world in which religious obligations are based on rational determination. So using reason and factual analysis in order to determine truth rather than divine commands, because God said so. Pranav and I are not going to actually give you the entire case because we're not going to spend 15 minutes prepping this, but we're going to chat for maybe like 5, 6 minutes together about how we would approach this debate strategically. That is, from opening government, what is the like path to victory that we want to go at? So I'm going to run a little timer next to me. Um, and we've not actually got this together before, so this will be genuine thoughts from both of us. We'll do like 6 minutes, I guess. We can
Yeah.
start kind of now. Let's just say like 15 seconds to think. So our brain's set up.
Yeah.
Okay. I have thoughts whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I have some thoughts.
Okay. I'll jump into it really quickly. So I think the best benefit that so opposition bench would have here on like why it is that we care that God says so, is that like God is authority. And so people are more likely to listen because like by nature, religion places this person as the most true, and therefore you are following because God says so. Here's the way I think you flip all of this though. Twofold. One, every religion by nature preaches that you do good things, not just for the benefit it receives to yourself, but because it in itself is good. Which means that if you're turning around and saying the only reason you're doing something is exclusively because God says so, and not because you actually believe in any sort of factor behind it, and or like what is truth, and like why this actually happens, your faith breaks down, right? At the point where God stops talking. So if God says you should only donate to the poor in X situations, it no longer can be stretched out afterwards. You are just less effective, and therefore like cannot be applicable. But also B, your service in nature is also just worse, right? You're producing worse goods off. I think this is like can be built out a lot more into explaining why is on the nature of what religions really care about, what religious obligations care about. You both care about the longevity of religion, so stepping outside of like the Torah, the Bhagavad Gita, the Bible, whatever it might be, and applying yourself on a daily day basis, which can only happen when you're focusing things on what is true and can be therefore cross applicable. And B, about like actual like duty and say about the idea that you actually emulate these bodies, you continue them throughout your entire life, not only at points where you want something from or from not God. Those are the immediate thoughts that come to my mind.
Yeah.
What are you thinking?
Yeah. The other flip that I can think of is even if it is more authoritative today, and I think it's important to try and ensure it is an intention with one, this is
Mm-hmm.
actually bad. And that's because it asks you to only trust the person at the top, right? So the problem with being or believing in God is that, or believing that it's God's word, is that who is seen as the voice of God, right? It's seen as the
Mm-hmm.
priest in many instances. And that in
Yeah.
very obvious means that anytime they have a bad incentive, then individuals just believe or buy into what they say, even if it's against their own interests.
Yeah. So this, and I see the question, but before I just jump into that, so the strategy behind this, Brad, would be really focusing on what is it that religious institutions and obligations directly want, which is usually to shift the behavior of individuals into like long-term decisions that they care about. And so the team that would win the round is explaining why you were able to fulfill the benefits of what an obligation is, both to an individual on like an individual catharsis basis, but also on religion as a whole. And then secondly, explaining why, because of those commands, it can only happen when you're focusing on reason and factual analysis. The answer really being here that like these are measurable, controllable. Like you can see the ups and downs yourself. They're not like ambiguous benefits. E.g., like not just like I'm going to go to heaven, I'm going to go to hell, and therefore I have to follow exactly what God says. But instead, like I see the returns of my investment and whatever that might be, which can strengthen your will to God if you say, I'm doing good, I see good happening, therefore good is true, therefore God is true. But bigger than that, that can only happen when you allow individuals the autonomy to make decisions versus like instituting that they ought follow the words just for the Pope or whatever that might be. Before kind of keep going, I see a question. Go for it.
Hi, sorry, can you scroll up a little bit? I think it was, oh yeah. Could you like explain the faith breaks down part again? Sorry, we didn't quite catch it.
Sure. Pranav, do you want to take a
Yeah,
stab
sure.
at it?
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. So like the way I've understood it, is basically like if all you have is just God and God's fate to go on, then in many instances, if a specific reality is proven bad or is false, that breaks down. What that means is, to give an example, right? If you are told that, God in many instances is telling you to, for example, donate X amount of money, and the more you do that donation, in some way it comes back to help you later in life, but you don't have any truthful statement or any reality on which that happens, i.e., you're a poor person who just donates, you don't see your life actually get any better, then in many instances, the faith ultimately breaks down in yourself and makes you feel a lot worse. So I suppose like an important note is like tying it to a specific tangible example gets you pretty far. So like, the point is that if you like the point, I think ultimately in this case is if the priest tells you that if you do something just for God's sake, then ultimately at some point in time, right, if you don't find it benefiting you in your daily life, it's hard to keep having that trust or faith. You have a lot of doubts. If instead you were told that you instead believe or ought believe in something because it also helps you and you see how it helps you, then that's probably something that makes actually or increases your catharsis. So the reason it's a flip is that, it flips on someone on catharsis.
And also the exception also added here is that like what God tells you is not always like the actual literal scripture of God is time gapped, right? Like for example, the Bhagavad Gita is written hundreds of thousands of years or hundreds of years, not thousands. And so when it comes to new and new decisions, you have to wait for someone to tell you what to do. That is like what to do today with regards to technology, what to do today in regards to like how we provide seva or like provides like gift or whatever now that we are in a more like modern world. And that's what like not thunder. Sort of part of second extension really clicks in here, right? Where okay, who now is that authoritative body? That's kind of what we're focusing on. The reason that we both look at it this way, though, is that as you can tell through what we've both been discussing, is we're emphasizing where is it that this debate is likely to occur. That's A. So on an individual basis, what happens as well as on a collective basis. But B, what is it that happens when you just listen to God? So that is, how do individuals feel? What do they react like? And third off, and I guess the most important thing is, if authoritativeness happens, that's the best benefit of God, of all, which is like God is the best and the truest, and people will therefore listen to it on a daily basis. So accepting the best benefit or the highest or the most likely solution of opposition, why is that bad? And I want to put an asterisk here before we move into the second scenario because I see we're a little shorter on time. This is kind of the most important thing that Pranav does. A lot of debaters come up and say, okay, how do I weigh even if analysis if like I have to just then defend their side? Like if I wanted to weigh even if analysis in this case, I need to build the op argument, tell me why op is good, and then like yada yada yada. You don't. Instead, it's not trying to prove that the benefit they want, the impact that they want is true. That is, you're not trying to prove that like because God is authoritative, people listen and people listening is good. Like you don't have to defend why it is that people following religion is bad. You're not accepting their impact, you're accepting their premise. That is, you're accepting the truth of, okay, in the world where God is the most authoritative and people are going to listen, why is that a problem? Not because people listen, this will be good, and then you're defending it. So again, it's not the impact comparison you're doing here, you're accepting the premise comparison, which is okay, accepting the premise where this is probably going to be the most authoritative. Why at that level is this a problem? And that is your even if analysis there. That's how that would sound like. Unless we have more to discuss on this topic, we could probably riff a little bit longer on it. I think we'll probably move to section 2.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
And
So yeah. The second thing I think to note is what you can do sort of during the debate. I think what we sort of want to do is just walk through a couple of different possible scenarios. Assume you're any like a closing team, CG or CO, probably I think the specific case will say which one. And sort of just trying to understand what you may do once you hear what that round is. So it's not necessarily giving you a full extension, but at least may give you the starting point of where you think you ought to enter the debate.
asterisk here before you jump into it. What Pranav is describing is probably the first 2 to 3 sentences of a proper MG or proper MO. So most standard MGs or MOs acknowledge the top half and explain what they are doing. And so, for example, this can be top half discusses privacy is the most important impact. The issue is this isn't the most important actor for X or impact for X, Y, and Z reason. This is how we'll enter the debate. Or top half goes back and forth on this context, but they've missed X item and therefore care about Y context. Or OG has said this, but it was sufficiently responded towards this, taking O at its best. This is what we're doing. This is positioning your case within the round, which is a lot more helpful than just telling me your case. And again, waiting until up whip or gov whip to explain what it does to the top half. And so this is what you want to be listening to in the topic in the entirety of your round. Mind you, second speakers, in my opinion, and also first speakers, should be communicating this. You should know how your case is interacting by the end of like, for example, if you're a member of government, by the end of prime minister, beginning of deputy prime minister is when you begin to think about how your case is interacting, or honestly have a good idea. Same thing for like opening opposition or for closing opposition. By the end of LO, maybe the beginning of the DPM, you have this understanding. You need a speech and a half before to actually write your case, which is why this needs to be communicated. Second speakers, because you are flowing the speech by nature, are really good people to be communicating these things. This is how you can share the burden from your partner.
Yeah. Like the thing to note is, for people who judge, probably will know this. More often than not, for better or for worse, if a specific like judge is listening to a member, it's really helpful to be able to, as soon as possible, make the judge go, okay, I understand where this extension is trying to do. They need to understand the path to victory. If they don't do so, right, for better or for worse, judges can run the risk of sort of under listening or not paying as much attention to the rest of the extension as you would like them to. And this is to some extent like a human thing, right? Like they've listened to 4 speeches worth of material. This is not a judge at like full attention. So you need to snap into focus. This is how we want to win. You need to give an aha moment for them to feel it is worth listening to the judge, listening to the speaker for the rest of the speech. Think of the first 20 to 30 seconds as the pitch you're making to the judge. I am pitching you why you ought credit us to win, why you ought make us win. Notice the difference between how many other speakers do it. Often they'll try and start their speech in like a less than efficient way. Be something like, OG says this, OO says this, let's do some rebuttal. I have 3 pieces of thing I want to say. I want to do this. This is not great, right? The MG or MO has to start with a snappy, fast, like a snappy, clear thing that just snaps into focus. This is the path to victory that we're going to get to. And that's, I think, where really we're trying to get towards throughout the thing. Figuring out the path to victory, part and parcel of that is telling the judge the path to victory as soon as you can. Okay, let's go through a couple of examples of this. So the first one is on lustration. Hopefully you can read. It's a policy which involves removal and political exclusion, often without trial, of officials at all levels of the political system associated with former regimes and their political parties. This process is normally conducted by the new, more democratic establishment. So something like this house supports the use of lustration in newly formed democracies. Quickly, opening government argues the old regime is unaccountable and did human rights violations, and that's why they must be removed by a newer, more reasonable regime, so there is no risk they can do such terrible things. Opening opposition argues actually kicking out the old regime to this extent causes serious backlash, as that regime's supporters will protest and riot. Closing government argues the old regime is actually corrupt and it had bad economic policies, and hence the new regime can get better FDI when they are entering. So the question is, like, what can closing opposition do? And I think really the deeper question that is asking is there an underlying presumption that all 3 teams have made that you can exploit to your advantage? So in this case, right, there is an underlying presumption that the other teams have made that you can attack, which is they've sort of made the presumption, I think, that a more democratic new establishment must necessarily thereby mean a very good establishment in general, i.e., there is a presumption that the new regime is always a significantly better alternative than the old regime. And you can question this. So quickly, I often recommend that if you're starting something that starts with like such a radical reframe, it's helpful to have some illustrations or examples. So examples that you should know, for example, FARC versus the right-wing government in Colombia is a pretty decent example, where both the new and the old regime have often done problematic or violent things, right? The LTTE, when they were fighting against Sri Lanka, often indulged in significant acts of violence. So a lot of them are instances in this. So you can start with a good illustration. The second step, which I think a lot of teams misses, you want to prove that illustration. Why is it the likeliest interpretation that the new regime and old regime are often not significantly better than the other in either instances? And you can give a couple of things to say, right? I won't go over like mech of the entire case, but for example, you can argue that often the revolution had to involve some elements of violence because, quite crucially, the old regime has the incentive to crack down on, the new sets of protesters fighting against them. And often the way the new protesters react is by also arming themselves and protecting themselves. But what starts as protection can often end up in huge collateral damage, sometimes things like human shields, that sort of stuff, right? Another classic reason is a lot of times proxy wars are really what happens when you have regimes or alternate regimes. So in Syria, whether you talk about the Syrian revolution or you talk about Bashar al-Assad, often oppositional regimes like Saudi Arabia versus Iran are funding them in different ways. The Houthi rebels versus the main regime often are funded by different actors. All of this puts some doubt or casts questions as to whether the new regime is significantly better than the old regime. This is a good starting point, because if like, hopefully you understand what, like, the path to victory looks like. Basically, it would be, if the new regime and old regime aren't significantly better than the either, sometimes the best check and balance is the other regime, for better or for worse. Maybe the way you make both of them in a race to the top involves accepting that two imperfect actors can hold each other accountable much better than letting one imperfect actor win the debate outright. I'm not going to say this is like a slam immediate dunk, but you can see why this might be a bit easier than just refuting each and every team's characterization, saying why this might be wrong, why that might be wrong, why that might be wrong. Instead, you found the underlying presumption, you're questioning that presumption, and you've immediately got a judge to care about what you're trying to say next. If you now prove your frame to a greater extent, and then you explain the impacts of that, you're probably in a very good state. Like, I remember using a version of this in a debate, and definitely it helped very easily, because all the other teams just asserted that old regimes were uniformly terrible, new regimes were uniformly good. Nobody explained why this was the case. So sometimes you see, whereas if you're the first team to explain why you are right or why you are more likely to be true, immediately you're in such a big spot, like, and you're often the last team speaking as well. So, like, things work very well for you. So that's the first
If you want, I
example.
can do the second example if you want.
Okay.
So the second one is this has regards to commercialization of social movement. And so first one kind of asks you to look at the like immediate premise. This one I'm going to ask you to look at what comes first, or how, like, what is logically prior. So opening opposition to this says commercialization of social movements is necessary for to increase the reach and awareness of such movements. That is, only if corporations like support social movements will people get aware. Can CG question this? The answer, just for the sake of time, is absolutely, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? You can argue that corporations are also risk averse, and so don't go around and support any sort of political movement, but support ones that are already established. Example, it took Target or any other like pink washing, or more important, like LGBTQ pride merch production until like the late 2015s, 2016, which is like many years or decades after the queer movement really got a stronghold within most of the world. And the reason for this can be a fewfold. They are both risk averse, but also, again, consumer dollars drive the demand. That is, if consumers want a product, a lot of companies want to reach those consumers, and therefore, by literally the fact that they study these as well, are likely only going to answer this once the demand already exists. This is a flip of opening opposition and questions which is likely to come first, and is able to sufficiently take down their mechanism, because you're not sitting here explaining if it's good that corporations are aware or not, and you aren't kind of going back and forth on mitigating if this reach and awareness is enough. You're just saying which comes first. Is it likely that it just like corporations pick up small moves and go with them? It's not. And so this is again another way where you can think about the premise, and again, which is logically prior.
Yeah, that's yeah. Third example. So this house supports the use of economic warfare against belligerent states in order to force compliance with the rules of the global economic order. So example, opening up the economy, protecting IP, not engaging in currency manipulation, etc. So in essence, it's about, whether you should use tariffs or sanctions against states that, do things like open up, or like they do things like are too protectionist, that do things like steal IP, these sorts of stuff. Opening government argues that protectionism is bad, that politicians often do it in bad ways, and forcing nations to open up helps that nation's economy and the people of that nation. Opening opposition proves conclusively, you can argue it probably beats opening government, that actually politicians of a nation have good incentives in helping their people and thus protect their own poor nation's economy, or steal intellectual property in ways that actually helps that nation's economy. So, similar to before, is there either an underlying presumption, or maybe, as I said before, what is the maximum you can concede of opening opposition and still find a way to win the debate? The answer could be something like this. OO is correct. Nations have incentives and good incentives in helping themselves, but that is often a bad incentive in helping the rest of the world, i.e., a nation choosing to steal intellectual property, choosing to engage in currency manipulation does help the few people in their nation, but it harms the nations they are stealing that IP property from. it harms the nations whose currencies is now a lot weaker relative to theirs. So you see how you are conceding that politicians do what's best for their people, but there is no incentive to do what's best for people in other nations. They are not voters in your economy. They are not people who can protest in your nation. And this is why you ought force belligerence. You can see how immediately it leads to like natural ways of weighing, right? Opening opposition helps people in one nation, but harms people in many other neighboring nations. We're happy to bite the trade-off. People in that one nation may be a bit harmed, but in the end, you're doing it for a greater good. You took OO at its best, you bit the trade-off, and you explained why anyways you were winning. So this is a case where, again, you concede as much of their case and still win. They care about themselves. They're often bad at helping the others. There are like many versions of this that happen in many debates. For example, I've seen this in corporations. Someone argues that, guys, corporations have pretty good incentives in whether they choose to make risky decisions versus decisions that make profit. And another team can then come in and say, a closing can come and say, we agree. They make decisions that best or good for their own company, but that often may be bad for the rest of the market. So it's pretty stock or pretty classic, but often the way you choose to say it or the way you weaponize it in a round can be quite devastating because teams can make presumptions and you can exploit those presumptions.
Last example then. So this has regards to narrative of national exceptionalism, i.e. individual liberty makes America exceptional, multiculturalism makes Canada exceptional, etc. Assume that opening government argues this narrative is used to start international wars and politicians use this to sweep it under the rug. OO argues this narrative actually makes people hopeful and feel pride in their nation. Closing government instead argues that this narrative is used to stop people from giving meaningful criticism to outdated policies. How does CO interact in this debate? This is an example of thinking about the context, which is national exceptionalism does not happen every single day. Everyone does not just wake up in the morning and go, America is great because it has liberty, good morning alarm clock. This usually happens at certain points. And so that's the first question. When do you think about this narrative? Sidebar, by the way, no narrative debate is always happening 24/7. It usually happens because of something. That's how we shift our behavior. So the question is, when do we see national exceptionalism at its best? It's usually when a nation has felt some sort of pain or some sort of trauma and is trying to collectivize. This can be literally after conflict. This can be after the formation of a state. This can be after fundamental values were challenged, e.g. attacks on the state from other individuals, so on and so forth. Given those apex points, let's call them flashpoints, what happens like then? Why does this narrative matter at those points? And so, for example, CEO can enter this debate by saying, okay, this narrative matters the most, not only just at points of conflict, but actually at the beginning of a nation, where we try to decide what values does our nation state stand for? What core ideas do we center ourselves around? And not just for like conversational purposes, but how do we create structures and institutions that emulate those values? Example, like the birthplace of America happens both like the Articles of Confederation happens because the British had taken over so much control as a national, or I guess in this case, like dictatorial regime or whatever you want to call colonization. At that point, the biggest thing states wanted was states representation. So the Articles of Confederation for the first 10 years removed literally any national oversight, instead provided the majority of the rights towards statehood. And that existed because the values after a post-conflict American, or post-conflict America, whatever you'd like to call it, really emphasized the idea of individual values and freedom. And with this, you can extend the case for a long period of time, explaining why it is that these precedents are so valuable and like long could, and by maintaining these precedents is the only way that you actually have anything else in the debate. That is, only because I know liberty matters the most, because it's existed for 200 years, and because like my people, or whatever you want to call it, fought for it and died for it, and I'm told on a daily basis that they did not have it beforehand and therefore have it now. Am I likely to care 200 years later when minorities do not have access to liberty? Or am I likely to care about critiquing the nation state for not maintaining these values? This is setting the context. It's acknowledging that this debate doesn't happen at every single point. It doesn't happen all the time. And therefore, at the points where it does, is the most impactful. It also gets you out of what happened in this round, which is a lot of like, when does this motion happen? Where does accountability occur? Which came first, accountability to the narrative or narrative to accountability? And this explains, okay, it doesn't really matter if that like sort of set up. The place where it's exclusive is when there wasn't a nation to begin with. And at that point, here's where this occurs. Another good example of this, unironically, is last year's NAUDC as well, which is a narrative about like hope, about like being pessimistic all the time or like optimistic all the time. I should know this better. Sidebar though, the way that we enter in as closing government is going, this narrative does not happen on a 24/7 basis. You don't just sit around 24/7 going, the world is going to hell and I'm going to live my life horribly. This narrative happens at points of like, at negative points, but also responding to positive examples. Eli gives a really funny example, which is one day your cat can die and the next day you can have a really good meal and life still feels really valuable. Don't do that, but provide better examples explaining why this notion is going to happen at every single point. Plugging that. Anyways.
Yeah. I can tell you, as someone who actually was judging that round at the same time, all of the panel had the same reaction throughout the debate, which was almost a sense of like hopeless resignation because every team asserts that this is the way the narrative happens. And then basically once Eli starts a speech, almost all of us just sit up in our chairs because we're like, thank God there is something to anchor the debate to, because there is some explanation why this is the likeliest version of that debate, i.e., which actor controls this narrative, how is that narrative likely to be played out from that actor's incentives. So like whenever we say like judges sit up when they understand how you're trying to win, we're genuinely talking from personal experience. Okay, there is another kind of scenario that we sort of talk about. I think it's already been engaged with, so I will not go over it. But as you notice in some points in time, and as we probably go over now again, find ways to be efficient in your rebuttal. Sometimes like a motion that says advocating for one kind of change over another kind of change may still involve non-topical arguments being made. Corporations being terrible doesn't mean that you shouldn't advocate for changing their behavior. So making links explicit to the motion is key. And in instances where other teams don't make that link, call them out on it.
The number
Okay.
of times teams lose because they're not topical to the motion is exceptionally high. It's not because these debates are bad. It's because we're running at a high speed and people are talking generally about a clause and not explaining why this motion happens. In any sort of time, prep, debate, whatever it might be, the question that should ring through your mind is, why does this motion change that? Better yet, visibly and verbally ask that. What does this motion do and why is it only that this motion changes that? If you cannot answer that, that means that you're not being topical to the motion. That's just a quick little asterisk towards this. I think we're gonna transition to like the third one. So we're gonna play a video. And this idea is like, and the purpose of this activity is to think about what to do before your speech. Because sometimes a lot of debaters will just, because they're so hyped and hopped on this, will proceed to just respond to all the content they heard from the speaker in front of them, which is fine, but you have a limited amount of resources of time. And so when you are spending your entire time just responding to everybody, it is not effective. Right? Like if you just spend your entire time responding to every single argument that is not within the round, you are wasting your time from like doing other things, weighing, preemptive framing, whatever it might be. So active listening is quite important. What we're going to do is listen to 14 minutes. I know, but it's quite important. And I would heavily suggest that you flow it and then open this discussion up. We're going to ask you, if you were the DPM, what do you do? What do you need to respond to? What do you not need to respond to? And then we'll play to you the 1 to 2 minutes of the DPF that respond to the entire case. We're hoping to finish by 11, it's about 25 minutes. So in about 25 minutes, we will be done. Barring any other questions, the motion is this House believes the West should invest domestically in schools that provide alternative progressive interpretations of religious text to combat radicalism. Whenever you're ready. Pranav, your audio is not sharing.
No. Okay.
Unless all of you can read lips, I'm going to let Pranav reshare the audio.
Sorry, that was like the other skill we didn't manage to teach that we're going to get to now.
We're going to have to work Zoom.
Okay. Let's see. Let's hope. Fingers crossed.
I don't know, religious extremism
Can you hear it?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
and it can look like law attack.
No, Pranav, I got it. Don't worry about it. I'll share it.
Ooh.
I don't know what your audio is doing, but it won't work for me. Or at least it won't work for me and nobody else can hear it.
Okay.
Sorry, give me like 1 second. I'll pull it. I also have the video here. While we do this, does anyone have any questions before we keep going into this? No, we're just such clear explainers that you can't have any questions there.
Oh, we're explaining something so basic that they're like, what the hell? This is what the standard
right.
is fallen to.
Sure. Good luck, everyone, whenever you're
Is this
ready.
audible to everybody?
Yeah, to me it is.
Hi,
Yeah.
just to check before I start, am I audible?
Yes, all good.
Panel: religious extremism is rising in the West. It can look like lone wolf attacks from those inspired by ISIS or other Islamic terrorist groups. It can also look like Christian fundamentalism on the rise and attacks on things like BLM, for instance, or other kinds of protest movements. It is generally on the rise, and we think alternatives to battling this kind of religious extremism have failed. But before I get into argumentation, let's make it very clear what is the kind of model that we are supporting. I think the first thing that we need to talk about is that we have a panel of experts and clerics who are obviously going to be representative. So this looks like people from within the Islamic community, from different kinds of races, different genders, collaborating together, assessing the syllabi of these schools, perhaps also giving recommendations on what the syllabi should be for these schools to go forward, and therefore advising the government on which schools to invest in and which schools to not invest in. The second thing that we're looking for, obviously, is whenever the government is coming up with syllabi, they have anti-racism and sexism guidelines, which are used in setting up curricula. We're obviously going to use that over here as well. The third thing that we just find with is that the government can either set up new schools which teach this sort of curricula, or give funding to additional existing schools which already teach this sort of curricula. The fourth thing I want to emphasize is, in terms of the curricula, we already use these kinds of hermeneutical devices when we're talking about progressive religious texts and interpretations. What are we talking about over here? I think there are two things that religious communities which are progressive oftentimes do. One is there's a selective interpretation of events that gears towards more, progressive ideals. What does this mean? This looks like, for instance, us telling Muslim kids that Hazrat Aisha was allowed to go on the battlefield, and it was okay for women to not only fight others but also help actively. So their role is not in the home. The second thing is there's a selective ignorance of events and also other kinds of things in scripture. So, for instance, not teaching kids about verses in the Quran which support sexual slavery or slavery of any kind. I think these are the kinds of things that already happen within the status quo, which we are absolutely fine with doing. So, what is the problem in the status quo? I think the existing alternatives to fighting religious extremism are already failing. These are failing in two respects, and we just need to look at what the kinds of responses from governmental authorities are over here. The first kind of response is retrospective or after the fact. This looks like maybe a bombing has happened, and now the government is on the hunt for who the terrorists are, or who this terrorist organization is. The problem there then is that the harm has already been incurred, and this is merely retrospective. You're only trying to bring people to justice as opposed to preventing the harm to begin with. The second thing is you're often aggressive and reactive when you're trying to preempt harm. So this looks like more securitization and more policing of communities. This looks like what happens in France, for instance, where Muslim communities have more police involved within their respective areas and zones. Or this looks like brown people at airports being stranded for hours at end because they're suspected as terrorists without any sort of knowledge for whether they are or not. Why is this harmful then? Because I think in the first instance, this is useless because this is happening after the fact. But secondly, this is oftentimes counterproductive. That is to say that you perpetuate cycles of violence because these people specifically feel discriminated against from things like the police or from events that happen at the airports. And the problem with this is even people who are moderates within these communities, because of feelings of otherization and discrimination, go towards more radical forms of action against a society that they feel is discriminating against them. Arguments then on this side of the house. Firstly, I just want to point out we have more buy-in for these schools. What is the existing problem within these communities? I think ethnic and religious enclaves have formed within the West. This looks like Muslims, for instance, sending their kids to only Muslim high schools, which oftentimes have very radical interpretations of what the Quran says or what Islam says. This also looks like Christian communities sending kids to, Christian schools and so on and so forth. So you only either go to schools within your own communities or religious schools, or secondly, even in the instance where you go to public high schools, which don't have, religious texts as part of of their discourse. The problem then is the socialization that happens at home. That is, parents who are oftentimes either radical in terms of their beliefs or are first generation or second generation immigrants who have carried on those beliefs from the countries that they came from, oftentimes are the only source of information that kids have for their socialization and their interpretation of Islam. This is what we stand to change. Why are parents likely to send their kids to these schools? But before that, I'll take a point from CEO.
Just as a clarification, there are different educational systems in the West, some of which allow parents to opt for their kids to go to certain schools, others of which force kids to go to certain schools. Would this be part of a system which forces kids to go to specific types of schools you set up?
I mean, in areas where you're forced to go to schools, we're happy with including some part of, religious education within your syllabi, like an extra class for Muslim students. I don't care. Okay, in terms of buy-in, two reasons for why we have buy-in. One, clerics and religious authorities have said that this is the right syllabus. So within these religious communities, these authorities have a lot of power because they are literally your conduit to God. They're telling you what God said, but also your only way of speaking to God. So I think that's one reason for why there's buy-in within these schools. But secondly, these schools are getting investment from Western governments. This means that they have more resources, more facilities. Your kids have better life chances if they go to these schools. Their education is much better off. Parents are incentivized to send their kids to these schools. Now, what are the impacts of this? The first impact that I have is you battle the us versus them mentality. So right now, the problem for these people is they feel otherized, because even when Joe Biden is trying to solve the problem of Islamophobia, what he says is, we must talk to Muslim communities as Americans, or Americans need to deal with this Muslim problem. This obviously misses the fact that Muslims are also part of America and are Americans themselves. So they are otherized. What we do is we make them feel included and cared for, crucially, because the messaging now is we care for your religion and we're going to help teach it to you, and we're going to give you access to discourses within your religion. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to note is that kids are much better off, because kids oftentimes lock themselves out of opportunities. So for instance, Muslim kids who don't want to get into the banking sector because interest is haram in Islam, for instance, or more crucially, girls within these communities who are told don't go for jobs in the future or don't go for extracurricular activities because this is un-Islamic or irreligious. We prevent this sort of locking out of opportunities, because what we are doing is equipping the next generation with the ability to obviously interact with these sorts of discourses which are much more liberal, and tell them, please access these kinds of opportunities. So in their lives, they're much better off. The third thing we do is we battle media discourse. So regardless of whether we actually get kids or communities to be much better off, what we are doing is we are changing interpretations of, say, Islam within media in the Western discourse, where Islam is only noticed as this extremist sort of religion where the Afghan Taliban interpretation dominates Fox News and even CNN. What we are now forcing these sorts of, because the messaging of the government policy and that sort of effect, what we're forcing these communities to do is realize what Islam actually is, and we are therefore reducing discrimination against these communities. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. And it's time for Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Okay. The problem with opening government is that they assert they're going to get imams and religious scholars to work with them, but they at no point explain why it is in their interest or why this is something that's likely to happen. We posit that the interest of these religious authorities is to maintain control and maintain the religious interpretations in the way that they currently exist. So the likely way that this policy is going to work is one where the state is imposing on these communities and creating the, like a specific progressive interpretation that goes against a lot of what these people are preaching. Two things in opening up. One, why even the progressive schools that you get are bad and are limited in their ability to help these people, clashing with opening government. And second, why this doesn't actually solve the root of radicalization and why you likely get worse backlash from these communities. First, I think the counterfactual on our side is pretty simple. I think what we will do is we'll do things like support mosques, and we'll support other avenues of religious authority and show that we're supporting these communities, because oftentimes the reason why radicalization happens is because people feel that the state neglects their communities and they don't get support or they're not accepted in the mainstream. Second, we'll also support secular schools in these communities. And I think this is far better, and we'll explain why this is true. Because if what opening government wants is for these people to have more opportunities and to have more freedom, I think the fundamental problem is that when you have religion at the forefront of your education, this crowds out the access for you to get opportunities or other things. So first then, why is religious schools in particular bad, even if they're progressive? I want to note there are a few key aspects of religion that make it so that it guides your education and is likely to be the guiding doctrine of prioritizing other things, like prioritizing over other things. One is, I think that because of how religion is preached to you, it is very hard for you to question these doctrines. So because it is authority from God, because you have, like, these people have authority in these communities, and because this is preached to you in other areas as well, it is very hard for you to question these specific things, even if they're progressive. So I think the problem then is that there are some cases where your religious authority or your religious teaching is going to contradict with other things that you see in school, or is going to contradict things in like science classes or other things like that. So I think in those cases, what happens in your religious schools is you deprioritize teaching them things like reproduction or like women's rights, or like safe sex and things like that. And a lot of these things get deprioritized because you're trying to propose religion. The second thing is, I think when you have religious schools, you also deepen and strengthen the authority of these communities. And I think it makes it harder for these people to escape the kinds of problems that opening government talks about. Because opening government says that a lot of these people artificially limit their choice because they're brought up in religious communities. I think when you have progressive schools, this makes it worse. One is because I think you reinforce the other avenues of authority from a young age. So now it's no longer just your parents telling you that religion is good or that this is something that you're brought up in. It's also in school where you spend most of your time, and most of your time is dominated. So this becomes like far more like involved in your life. Second, I think there's just far more religious authorities that you interact with when people in your school are also religious authorities. So when you have an imam at school, instead of just at the mosque, your religious identity is no longer something that's spatial, that's just when you're in the mosque or when you're in that particular zone. It's something that is all encompassing because you spend most of your time in school, and like you interact with more religious people. So I think this means, one, you're going to feel more obligated to this community, and it's going to be harder for you to break away from these values. So I think even if you want to do things like break away from religion, or you feel like this isn't meaningful to you anymore, it's harder for you to break away from this. Second, I think you're more likely to feel obligated to these authorities because these are people that are going to help you with like your tests, like help you like understand math and science and all these different things. And you're going to feel a greater obligation to them. So if they tell you to do certain things, or they tell you like, oh, you shouldn't be acting this way, or you shouldn't do certain things, you're likely to listen to them, and they're likely to have greater control over your life because you interact with them more. I think generally this means a few things. One, I think it just means that a lot of the restrictions to like people's rights that opening government wants to talk about doesn't actually change. So even though you may have like some like more progressive interpretations of these religions, you still get restrictions to these people's rights, and you still get restrictions to these people's freedoms. Second is, I think crucially, you crowd out other types of investments, because a lot of the times in places where you have religious investments or religious schools, you don't have other actors moving in who have secular or like non-religious like schools. So instead of the state setting up like a secular school where you can prioritize things like sexual education or science and things like that, you now have this progressive school, and you no longer have the ability to build the secular one. So I think for that reason, like these progressive schools are still bad. Second then, why do we think this is counterproductive to solving radicalization? Before that, I'll take CG, sure.
Based on your logic, would you then oppose the existence of Sunday school for Catholics, or is there something different about that?
Yeah, we're fine opposing that as well. What is the root of radicalization? I think the main reason why people are radical in these states is because they feel like the state has failed them, or the state doesn't support their identity, and they're isolated. I think the other major problem is that you have religious authorities that have the ability to interpret scriptures in a way that like goes against the interests of the state. The other key thing to note is that this doesn't just happen in schools. These religious authorities also exist in mosques and other avenues in these communities. So given this, why is this bad for radicalization? I think one, it means that even if you have progressive interpretations in your school, it's unclear why you're going to get those progressive interpretations in the mosque. Given that the mosque is like a greater religious authority than your classroom, I think it's easier for these people to just reinterpret things or say, no, actually what you're learning in school is actually more in line with like the traditional type of Islam that we teach. And it's unclear why these interpretations actually change. The second thing is that they have an incentive to do this, and they are unlikely to want to change their thing. So I think one is because like the collective memory of these people in these communities is one of more conservative or more radical teachings. So it's unlikely that these people are going to change. But second is there's no incentive for these people to change because it helps them maintain their authority when they have more radical forms of religious teachings. Why then is this like a bad thing? One, I think when you have the West intervening in these places, it's likely to be seen as an imposition. So it's not the West like trying to help these people. It's the West trying to change their culture and change their identities and shift it away from what is like tied to their homeland and tied to their identity. So I think this is more likely to receive backlash and people are going to feel threatened in these areas. Second, I think it's unlikely that you change authorities in other avenues that are more powerful. Third, I think the comparative is just better because one, you can just create avenues where these people are more skeptical of religion by teaching them science or logic or other things. And two, I think you just create less spaces for these people to interact with religion. So religion is less powerful in their lives when you have secular schools. Very proud to oppose.
Okay, now that I've made all of you listen to the rad, let me ask you this. Take a minute, and like this will be kind of where we end our discussion after this. What do you need to do as a DPM? But what do you do? This is an open-ended question. Part of it I know. So, what do you do?
I think that like basically, is there a simple way to stop LO?
Like how do you respond to opening opposition? You are the deputy prime minister. What do you need to do? What do you have to respond to? How would you? Give me an idea. Anyone. First question. What is opening opposition arguing? Please don't make me cold call. That'd make me really uncomfortable. I'd be very upset if I had to cold call someone.
Okay, I'll bite.
Thank you.
I think to some extent you have to prove that it's not going the way that this is going to be implemented isn't going to be invasive or impose upon the existing like history and culture of a lot of these communities. I think that's really hard to do and perhaps could have been preempted with a model like that was more defined and fleshed out.
You're not wrong. You've done the thing that I think most good teams would do. But I want you to answer me this question. And this is, I guess, to anybody, Harsh can answer, but also Stina or both of UST debate, you can answer this. What is opposition arguing? Like, what are they make 2 to 3 claims. One claim is their counterfactual, and one claim is against government. What is their counterfactual? Anybody but Harshita, if they're here. If not, Harshita, what is the counterfactual?
Just that like you should invest in like mosques or like other avenues that exist to make like religious communities feel like they're getting support from the state, so that because that's the reason why you get like alienation within these communities, or that's the reason why they feel like detached from the state. So
For opening government or opening opposition?
OO says that.
Well, they say something very specifically. What is the one specific thing they say they'll fund instead?
You said other avenues. What do you?
Yeah, they give one very clear example of this. Stina, if you're here, jump in. If not, USC debate if you're here. Yep, Stina answers it. Secular schools in those communities. OO says, instead of funding all these other programs, we're going to fund secular schools. What do they have as a problem with the government bench? What's their big problem as to why they don't think opening government has any efficacy? LO says one very big clear line. USC, if you're here, take a stab. What are the problems? Or anyone else? What's the big problem they have? Okay, the big problem that they have is they say there's no like these uber religious institutions do not care. They aren't going to change. Like this is not effective. If you make them progressive, they aren't going to listen. People are indoctrinated. Nothing's going to happen on their side of efficacy. They say it's not effective to try to get new like interpretations in because nobody understands and nobody cares. And instead, we should be focusing on positive interpret, or we should be focusing on secular schools and not really trying to focus on those. Connecting these two pieces of dot together. So their first argument is that the counterfactual is better about secular schools. Their second argument is no one's going to listen because these schools are uber religious. People aren't willing to shift religious norms wildly. How would you respond to this in the deputy prime minister? I'll give you like a minute to think, and then if not, we'll jump in and give you the answer. Okay,
Oh,
go for it.
okay. Like perhaps the goal isn't to convince the most conservative of conservatives that like you should buy that, I don't know, the LGBT community isn't like sinning or whatever, but that you're trying to get to like people that are like youth populations that are in schools that are already like
I'm gonna pause
so
you right there. You're just responding to their argument. You're doing very good responses. Everything you're saying is smart. Yes, you can limit what groups you're talking about. Yes, we're not talking about uber conservative. But I'm just gonna give you the argument once again, and I want you just to step away from the debate and just look at this as like if you were in a class. They say the reason that you can't have progressive interpretations is because these people are incredibly religious and therefore really care about the religion in the first place, so on and so forth. Like religion is one of the most important things towards them. They aren't going to shift with the progressive viewpoint, especially if they're from the West. Instead, they say we should introduce secular schools or non-religious schools. And those are the places where individuals will come and we will teach them how to be liberal and free and whatever.
Oh,
What's the problem here?
wait, if they're already super religious, why are they going to like accept a lot of the okay.
Bingo. And the first 5 seconds you have, literally, of Hamza's speech, was the next speech that comes up, is literally him going, opening opposition is a Spider-Man meme, where on one hand they say that opening government can't have any benefits because individuals do not like to listen to progressive viewpoints because they're so religious, but magically now that they're going to go to secular schools and forget their religion, what the hell? And legitimately, that is the only response he gives to opening opposition because they are out of the debate, because they are not specific towards the motion, and their counterfactual is a contradiction. That's it. Everything that Harshita just said is very true. That you can talk about how secular schools probably have one group over the other, or X over Y, or whatever the hell you want to do there. You're not wrong about that. Very good way. The problem is you don't need to do any of that because the premise in of itself is a walking contradiction. You cannot have both. And so I'd advise you, and I'll drop you the link. The link is going to be like linked to this recording as well. I'd advise you to listen to the next like 7 minutes of the DPM because the DPM never has to give even one like exclusive piece of rebuttal towards opening opposition because there is no need to. The case in of itself is here's why secular schools don't happen. So they took out the first kind of extension, which is the second extension, which is opening opposition saying, well, you're not effective in the first place. All Hamza has to do in this case is either A, repeat the mechanisms you got from the prime minister as to why you're effective and add on new ones and explain why it is that because you have these secular schools, the impact they talked about is going to happen. This comes through illustration. An example he gives, for example, a good example he gives is like the language that you can use to describe social issues is a lot more easier to discuss. That is like saying that people care about women's rights because Judith Butler told you to do so is antithetical and feels like westernized or unacceptable. But when you're able to explain it within the lens of religion that people already value, discussion can actually happen. This is effective. It proves why it is that this notion, and only when you have it from the West, can create the changes within religious institutions. And all of it is positive material. He's not spending any of his breath on responding to opening opposition. And all the positive material he's giving is also effective for him to weigh over the back half. Closing government has to do all the legwork to like all the material he's burning. CG now has to deal with. I think CG actually gets boxed out of this round because of that. On top of it, they have to do all like he has all the time in the world just to be explicitly weighing on his team. Time is a resource. The way you use it is the most important thing. Responding to the most important things saves you the ability to also like highlight your case, don't get me wrong. But the bigger thing it does is signal to the judge what the most important thing is. If I am a judge and I'm passively listening, because we all are, and you as a DPM spend 6 minutes responding to opening opposition, in this case, if Hamza spent 6 minutes responding to Ammar, you are validating their case as being legitimate. You are telling me that their case is valid, is logical, is reasonable, and I ought to take with more severity than I need to, versus acknowledging where it structurally falls and then going into it. Now, I don't think most rounds are going to be as cut clear in this case. That is, I don't think most rounds are going to be like what I would argue is a relatively strong contradiction at relative points, and therefore like able to just like take out opening opposition in one line. Also, DPM is an extremely strong speaker, and so the efficacy in which they can do this is a lot cleaner than I would argue myself from other people like easily. So in this case, do the observation and then give the even if analysis. In this case, even if secular schools existed, why are they not as effective? The answer is that like that mechanism. Secular schools by nature sidestep religion, which people, as both top half speakers have accepted, are the most important things, which means that true dissemination of this content cannot really happen. Comparatively, arming yourself with the language makes it more effective for you to actually have this discussion, and therefore that's why these changes occur. This is how you can look at your case. You're spending less time doing line by lines, more time focusing on big ideas, and above that, how change is going to occur. I don't know, Pranav, if you want to jump in on anything here.
No, I think that mostly is covered it. Just basically like you got to be aware of a lot of these things. A missing comparative, an unclear impact, a big contradiction, or a huge burden. These are the things you want to learn to get attuned for. Obviously, like at some point in time, like we can only give you ways to suggest getting there, but at least hopefully if you have an understanding of the goal to aspire to, the more you try and do things like drills, the more you maybe do things like judge. Those are all things that help you get better at figuring out what is the weak point, what is that point I want to attack and hammer home or prove the opposite of it, and thereby how can I quickly move on to other parts that I need to fix in my case.
Absolutely. The best skill to use here is active listening. The more amount of time you spend not just looking at how you can respond to a team, and more importantly, trying to understand what they are trying to prove. That is, what is their path to victory? What is their strategy that they want to interpret? Are you able to give a clear speech, but also not spend your time on unimportant content? This is the best way that you can approach this. I implore you to the entirety of the next of like NAUDC and the next like kind of prep season until the semester is over to do 3 things, and we'll kind of conclude here. 1, at the end, before you get up of your speech, whatever you are, except if you're prime minister, know who is winning. What is going on? Are you beating opening opposition? Is opening opposition being opening government? What are you doing? That is, who do you need to beat? Because the next question is, who are you trying to beat? It might not be that you want to take out the team that's the 1. Maybe you just want to take out the team that's the 2. But to do so, you need to know who they are. So that's number 1. Write down some sort of ranking or discuss it with your partner before then. The subsection towards this is at the end of the round, both you and your partner should individually rank the round and use a bit of be humble a bit and acknowledge when you could be taking the 4, when you could be taking the 2. But see if you're aligning with the judge. That's how you check your intuition on this. See if you were actually making sense. 3rd thing, listen to what the argument they are actually proving, not the impact they say they will prove. I don't care. A lot of debaters say they're going to fix racism if they tried. Like, it doesn't matter what debaters assert they're going to do. The question is, what mechanism have they actually proven? So before you just listen to the impact, ask yourself, what would this likely result in? If I was developing this, can I actually prove this is occurring? What is missing there? Your gut will tell you that. That's when you know. If you have 8 responses to their case, that means they're missing a structural mech. Instead of giving me 8 responses, which I'm not going to sit here and flow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's not going to be the most effective. I'm going to miss them. Ask yourself, what is the core thing that they haven't proven that's given me the opportunity to provide 8 responses? The last thing is, after your speeches is the best time to practice active listening. If you don't have the time to judge, that's super fine. But if you've given the DPM, you don't have a speech to give. So listen to the CEO as if you were CGG, like the next closing government and closing government existed, and listen to the speech and say, okay, now that I have no stake in the game, I don't have something I can physically write down or response I can literally give. Flow exactly what they were like you were a judge, and ask yourself, what's missing here? What have they not proven? And as you get more and more comfortable with this, you'll be able to do it within your speeches as well. But this is where you can actually practice that skill. For all intents and purposes, I think that's all that we wanted to cover. We'll post a document with this lecture slide as well. No problems whatsoever on that. Big shout outs to Pranav. Pranav helped me put this together like 45 minutes before we started, after I just kind of called him and said, would you like to do this today at like 2 p.m.? And so I really appreciate that. To all of you, I hope to see you in a week in Mexico. If you have any questions, please feel free to stick around here. We're more than happy to chat. You should have both of us on Facebook if not, and we'll see you then.
Bye,
Yeah.
y'all.
Sorry, you said that you'd attach the doc, right? That you guys were
I
using?
will attach the doc to this. Yeah, so when
Thank
we
you.
produce this lecture, the document will be attached. Do you mind ending the recording for a second, Pranav?
Bye.